The thing about London is that it never really stops moving. Even at 7 in the morning, when most cities are still half asleep and the coffee hasn't kicked in yet, London is already wide awake. The buses are running. The pigeons are arguing over something near the fountain. A man in a suit is walking so fast he might as well be jogging. And somewhere, always, a tourist is standing in the middle of the pavement with their phone pointed at the sky, blocking absolutely everyone. I've lived here for 11 years. 11 years of navigating this city, learning its rhythms, its moods, its little tempers. And for the last 6 of those years, I've worked as a walking tour guide, the kind who takes groups of strangers through the streets near the palace, the parks, the monuments, the places that make people fly thousands of miles just to stand in front of and photograph. I've done this route so many times I could walk it blindfolded. I know which paving stones are uneven. I know which lamp post has a dent in it from a minor car incident 3 years ago. I know the precise angle at which you should stand on the Mall to make Buckingham Palace look its most dramatic in a photograph. I know this city, but I did not know what was going to happen on the morning of the 14th of September. I did not see that one coming, not even close. Let me set the scene properly, because you need to understand the full picture before I get to the part that changed everything. It was a Thursday. Early autumn, the kind that London does better than anywhere else in the world, golden light, slightly cool air, the smell of something faintly burnt from a coffee cart nearby. The leaves on the trees lining the Mall had just started turning at the edges. Not full autumn yet, just a hint of it, like a warning. I had a group of 14 tourists that morning, mixed bunch as they always are. A retired couple from Ohio, Gerald and Patricia, lovely people, the kind who take notes and ask thoughtful questions. A young woman from South Korea who was solo traveling and had this quiet, observant quality about her, always a little apart from the group, always looking at things slightly differently than everyone else. 3 friends from Germany who had already informed me, in excellent English, that they had visited London before and therefore considered themselves experts. A family from Mumbai, parents, 2 teenage sons who were not particularly thrilled to be on a walking tour when they could have been sleeping, and a grandmother who moved slowly but missed absolutely nothing. And the rest were a scatter of different people, different countries, different ages, all gathered together under my little orange flag. That's the flag I carry, orange, so they can find me in a crowd. So I don't lose anyone near the Horse Guards or the roundabout by the palace. You wouldn't believe how easy it is to lose a grown adult in central London when something shiny catches their eye. We started at St. James's Park, as we always do. I gave the introduction, the overview, the little historical jokes that I've refined over 6 years to land consistently. Gerald laughed at the right moments. The German trio nodded seriously. The Korean woman whose name was Jeon was already photographing something none of us had noticed, a sparrow sitting on a rubbish bin, very still, looking profoundly important. Everything was normal. Everything was going exactly the way it always goes. We moved through the park, past the bridge over the lake, and I started heading the group toward the Mall. That long, wide, ceremonial road that leads straight to Buckingham Palace. If you've never walked the Mall on a clear September morning, let me tell you something. It's one of those experiences that makes you feel briefly like you exist inside a painting. The trees line both sides, and the light comes through in a certain way, and there's a quality to the silence underneath all the city noise that makes you stand up slightly straighter without realizing it. I had my route planned. I always do. We would walk the Mall toward the palace, stop at the Victoria Memorial for the main lecture about the palace's history, then cut toward the South Garden Wall, loop around, and end near the gate where the tourists could photograph the famous guards. Simple, clean, practiced. I first noticed Marcus at the halfway point on the Mall. He was about 40 meters ahead of us, leading a different tour group. I recognized him immediately, not because we were friends, but because in this industry, you know the other guides the way cab drivers know each other. You see the same faces at the same locations, you nod, you give each other a wide enough berth so your commentary doesn't bleed into theirs. Marcus had been doing tour longer than me, 8, maybe 9 years. He was loud, genuinely, professionally loud, the kind of voice that carries through wind and traffic without any effort. He wore a dark green jacket every single day regardless of weather, which had become something of a landmark in itself. His group was about 20 people, larger than mine, and they were clustered around him near the center of the path. I kept my pace steady, plenty of room, no issue. But then I noticed his group wasn't moving forward. Marcus was saying something, gesturing ahead. His voice wasn't carrying to me yet, but his body language was speaking clearly enough. He was pointing. He was looking at something. The group around him had turned in the direction he was pointing. I slowed my own group down, raised my hand. They stopped, and I looked ahead to see what Marcus was looking at. There was a royal guard standing in the middle of the route. Now let me explain what that means, because people often don't understand the specifics. Royal guards, the ones you see in the ceremonial uniforms, the bearskin hats, the red tunics, they have very specific positions they occupy. They're not random. They stand where they're supposed to stand, they move when they're supposed to move, and they do not deviate from their posts without reason. The ones you see at the palace are at the palace. The ones at the Horse Guards Parade are at Horse Guards Parade. They exist in known locations, at known times, in a system that has been running for centuries. A royal guard standing in the middle of the mall, alone, not at any formal post, was unusual. Not alarming, just unusual. He was standing at the edge of the pedestrian section, closer to the center of the path than the sides, in full ceremonial dress, the red tunic, the bearskin hat, white gloves, the entire ensemble. He was not moving. He was facing forward. He was, as far as any of us could tell, completely still. And he was blocking the natural flow of the pedestrian route. Not aggressively, not even intentionally, it seemed. But the way he was positioned meant that tour groups, which move in clusters and need a certain width of passage, had to navigate around him somewhat awkwardly. Marcus's group was larger and they'd hit this obstacle first. I watched Marcus say something to his group, gesture around the guard, and begin to steer people to the side. Standard adjustment, no drama. But then something shifted. A few people from Marcus's group tried to photograph the guard up close. This always happens. Tourists treat the guards like interactive exhibits. And in doing so, they tightened around the guard's position, which actually made the passage narrower rather than wider. Marcus was trying to manage them, redirect them, but 20 people moving in a cluster near a narrow point is not an easy thing to manage smoothly. And then I heard Marcus's voice clearly for the first time that morning. "Could you give us a bit of space, mate?" He said it to the guard, not rudely exactly, more like the way you'd say it to anyone who was inadvertently blocking your path, casual, slightly impatient. The tone of a man who has a schedule to keep and has encountered this kind of minor obstacle 100 times. The guard said nothing. He didn't move. He didn't blink, not that I could see from the distance. He just stood there, utterly still, doing what guards do, which is exist in a state of absolute immovability while the rest of the world continues spinning around them. "Right," Marcus said, louder now. "I'm going to need you to step to the left if that's all right. I've got a group here." Nothing. The guard did not move. Marcus waited a moment. I could see him from behind, and I noticed the set of his shoulders change, a slight tightening, the posture of someone whose patience is running low. Gerald, standing next to me, murmured, "What's happening?" And I told him quietly that I wasn't entirely sure yet. What happened next took about 30 seconds, but felt considerably longer. Marcus stepped forward, close to the guard, closer than you'd normally stand, and said, in a voice that was now clearly carrying to everyone in both tour groups, "Listen, I don't know what you're doing standing here, but you're blocking a public path and I have paying customers on a schedule. I'm going to need you to move." Still nothing. Are you hearing me? Nothing. And then, and this is the moment that everyone who was present has a different memory of, because it was so unexpected, Marcus lost his temper. Not dramatically, not explosively, but genuinely visibly in the way that real people lose their tempers when they've been pushed past the point of professional patience. His voice cracked slightly, rose in pitch, and he said loudly, clearly, to a guard who was not responding to him, "This is absolutely ridiculous. You are a person, not a statue. What is the matter with you? Move, please, just move." 20 tourists stared. My 14 tourists stared. I stood there holding my orange flag and stared. The guard did not move. I should tell you something about the psychology of that moment, because it matters. When a royal guard refuses to respond to you, there is a specific quality to that refusal that is unlike any other kind of being ignored. It's not the indifference of someone who doesn't care. It's not the distraction of someone who is busy. It is something much more precise than either of those things. A cultivated, trained, absolute stillness that communicates, without words, that your presence and your requests simply do not exist within the guard's world at this moment. It is, if you have not experienced it before, profoundly disorienting. Because the human instinct when someone speaks to you is to respond, even minimally. A flicker of the eyes, a shift of the weight, some acknowledgement that the words have landed. When that acknowledgement is completely and professionally absent, something in the speaking person's brain begins to misfire slightly. The words feel like they disappeared, like they were spoken into a wall. This is what was happening to Marcus. And I understood his frustration. I really did. Because in the practical reality of running a tour, an unexpected obstacle on a planned route is a real problem. You have people who have paid for a specific experience. You have a timing structure that keeps the tour coherent. You have momentum, and when you lose it, it's genuinely difficult to get back. And standing there while a guard simply ignored every word you said, in front of paying customers, in front of other tour groups, on a clear September morning with no apparent reason for any of it. That kind of powerlessness has a way of stripping the professional composure right off a person. Marcus was not a bad man. He was not even being particularly unreasonable. He was a tour guide whose route was blocked and whose requests were being ignored, and he had reached his limit. I completely understood. And yet, something made me pause. Something about the guard made me stop and look more carefully, because after 6 years of doing this route, after 6 years of seeing guards in their positions every single week, something was different. I couldn't name it yet, but it was there. My group was watching me, waiting for direction. I lowered my flag slightly, which is my signal for stay here, give me a moment. Gerald nodded. The teenage boys from Mumbai looked mildly entertained. The grandmother, whose name I had learned was Kavitha, was looking at the guard with an expression I couldn't quite read, not surprise, exactly. Something more careful. I moved forward a few steps, not into Marcus's space, but closer. And that was when I noticed it. The guard's white gloves. The right glove was different from the left. Specifically, the right glove, the glove on the hand at his side, had something on it. A stain or a dampness or something that had changed the texture of the fabric in a small but visible way. Not dramatic, just different, just there. And I noticed then that the guard's stillness was not entirely the normal stillness. The normal stillness is almost mechanical in its perfection. This stillness had something underneath it, a quality of effort, of something being held. I looked at the mall around us, the route we were on, the path ahead. And I thought, why here? Why standing here of all places, away from any formal post, alone? Marcus had stopped trying to speak to the guard. He had pivoted, was now addressing his group in his professional voice, explaining that they were taking a slightly different path today, adjusting the route. His professional composure had clicked back into place over the anger the way a lid snaps down on something. But his jaw was set, and his movements were tight. I watched him steer his group off to the left, around the guard, moving away. I did not follow. I stood where I was, orange flag in hand, my 14 tourists behind me, and I looked at the guard. And the guard, and I want to be very precise about this, because I have thought about it many times since, the guard moved his eyes. Not his head, not his body. Just his eyes, the faintest possible shift, the most minimal movement permitted to a person trying to remain absolutely still. They moved toward the path ahead, toward a specific point on the mall about 60 meters further down. It lasted maybe half a second. Then he was completely still again. I followed the line of where his eyes had briefly pointed. There was a man standing at the side of the mall near the trees. He had been there the whole time, I realized. I'd seen him in my peripheral vision, but categorized him as a normal bystander. He was dressed ordinarily, jacket, dark trousers. He was looking at his phone. But he wasn't moving. In a city where everyone is always moving, this man was completely still. And he was watching Marcus's group walk toward him. I don't know how to fully explain what happened in me at that moment. It wasn't a dramatic realization. It wasn't a sudden flood of understanding. It was more like the city around me went very slightly quieter, the way sound dampens when snow falls, and a single clear thought formed in my mind. The guard isn't blocking the route by accident. I looked back at the guard. The guard was still completely still, facing forward, utterly professional. My hand, the one not holding the flag, reached into my jacket pocket and found my phone. Gerald, who had walked up quietly beside me without me noticing, said softly, "Something wrong." I looked at him, retired from Ohio, thoughtful man, kind face. I said, "Could you do something for me without asking me why?" He looked at me for a moment. Then he nodded, "Sure. Tell the group to stay here, right here, don't let anyone walk forward." He didn't hesitate. He turned around and began speaking quietly to the group. I dialed the emergency line. What I told the operator was simple. A man standing still, watching a specific group of people. A royal guard positioned unusually, seemingly oriented toward this man. I know how that sounds. I know that when I lay it out like that, it sounds thin. It sounds like someone who reads too many thrillers and saw a man on his phone near a footpath. But the operator did not treat it as thin. They asked me for my exact location. They asked for a description of the man. They asked whether I could see any specific items, bags, packages, anything at the man's feet or in his hands. I looked. I described. I don't know what they heard in what I described. But within 4 minutes, I know because I was watching the time, the way you watch time when something is happening and you need to hold on to facts. I heard the sound that Londoners have a complicated relationship with. Sirens. Not many, not a wailing cascade of them. 2 vehicles moving fast coming from the direction of the palace. The man near the trees looked up from his phone. He looked at the approaching vehicles. And then he walked, quickly but not running because running would have looked like something, and he clearly didn't want to look like anything. He walked toward the edge of the path, toward a side exit that led toward Birdcage Walk. He never made it to the exit. I'm going to stop here at the end of part 1 and tell you something honest. I didn't know in the moments I'm describing what was happening. I didn't know the full picture. I knew what I observed, and I acted on what I observed, and I tried to be accurate in what I reported to the operator. That's the full extent of what I did. But the guard had known something before any of us did. He had been standing there, alone, in an unusual position, completely still, ignoring every word thrown at him. Because he was doing a job that had nothing to do with the ceremonial and everything to do with what guards are, underneath the uniform, before the tradition, at the core of what that training actually means. He was keeping people back. He was buying time. He was doing exactly what he was supposed to do, in the way that he was trained to do it, in complete silence, alone, while a tour guide shouted at him and tourists took photographs, and the morning went on around him as if nothing was happening. That is the part I keep coming back to. Not the sirens, not what came after, not even what we eventually found out about the man near the trees. I keep coming back to the guard. Standing there, completely still, taking every word Marcus threw at him without flinching, without explaining, without defending himself for a single second. Because he couldn't. And he had the discipline not to try. They took the man into custody near the Birdcage Walk gate. I know that because I saw it happen. 3 officers, 2 uniformed, one not moved toward him in that way that trained people move when they want to close a space without creating a scene. Fast but not aggressive, purposeful but calm. The man looked at them once, said something I couldn't hear, and then, without a struggle which surprised me, went with them. That was it, that was the visible part. The rest of it unfolded in ways I was not privy to, in vehicles and stations and rooms I would never see. And I had to make peace with only understanding the piece of the picture I had actually been present for. But let me tell you what happened on the mall in the minutes immediately after those officers moved. Marcus's group had gone. He had already redirected them south, and they were well away from the area by the time the vehicles arrived. I don't know when Marcus realized what had been happening, whether he found out that day or later, or whether he put the pieces together on his own. I would see him 2 weeks later at a different location, and we would look at each other with the specific silence of 2 people who both know something and don't know how much the other knows. But that's a later moment. I'll get to it. My group was still with me. Gerald had done an excellent job of holding everyone in place. He had apparently told the group that there was a police matter being handled and that we would resume shortly. This was not entirely inaccurate. The German trio had questions. The teenagers from Mumbai had their phones out. Kavitha, the grandmother, was standing very still and watching the guard. The guard had not moved. Even now, even as the officers moved, even as the vehicles positioned, even as the entire character of that section of the mall shifted from ordinary mourning to something else entirely, the guard remained at his post. Still, facing forward, white gloves, bearskin hat, red tunic, the full formal apparatus of his role. It was only when a second person in uniform, not a police officer but someone in a different kind of official clothing, the sort that doesn't announce itself loudly, walked briskly from the direction of the palace gate and spoke briefly and quietly to the guard, that anything changed. The guard's eyes moved. Then his head moved, a slight nod, barely visible. Then he stepped aside, smoothly with no ceremony, exactly one precise pace to the right, which cleared the path completely. He stood in the new position exactly as he had stood in the old one, still, upright, facing forward. As if nothing had happened. As if nothing had ever happened. I breathed out. I didn't realize I had been holding my breath until that moment. Not holding it dramatically, not in the movie sense of suspended tension, just the ordinary human response to sustained alertness, which is apparently to forget to breathe properly. Gerald appeared at my left shoulder. "Everything all right?" he asked. "Yes," I said, "I think so." "Good," he said. And then in the way of a certain kind of calm, measured person, ready to continue. I looked at my group, 14 faces, various expressions. The teenagers looked genuinely alert for the first time all morning. Jeon, the Korean woman, had her camera lowered and was watching me with quiet attention. The German trio were in conference with each other about something, but quietly. "Yeah," I said, "we're going to continue." I raised the orange flag. And we walked. Now here's the thing about professional composure. It's not fake. I want to make that clear because I think people sometimes assume that when someone in a service role snaps back into professional mode after something unusual, they're putting on an act. They're suppressing. They're performing normalcy over an internal wreck. Sometimes that's true, but sometimes professional composure is something you've built over years, genuinely, and it is as real as any other part of you. When I raised that flag and began walking my group forward and started talking about the architectural history of the route we were on, I was not pretending. I was doing something I knew how to do, and the familiarity of it was genuinely grounding. But I was also watching. I was watching the space where the man near the trees had been standing, watching the side exits, watching the officers, who were now mostly out of view, watching in the way that I think you watch everything around you for a few days after something like that, with a slightly different quality of attention. We moved forward. We reached the Victoria Memorial. I gave my lecture, the one about Queen Victoria herself, about the monument's commissioning, about the allegories represented in the figures at its base. Gerald asked a genuinely interesting question about the timeline of the statue's construction that sent me momentarily into slightly more detailed territory than usual, which I didn't mind. The teenagers photographed the memorial from several different angles, which was a vast improvement over their earlier phone-down indifference. Kavitha stood at the base of the memorial and looked up at the gilded figure at the top, the winged bronze of victory, for a long time. When the group moved on, she stayed a moment, and I slowed my pace to let her complete whatever thought she was having. When she caught up with me, she said, without any particular preamble, "That soldier, he knew." I looked at her. "He knew before the police came," she said. "He was standing there knowing the whole time." "Yes," I said. She nodded once, as if this confirmed something she had already understood. "My husband was a police officer," she said. 40 years. He used to say the hardest part of the job is knowing and not being able to say. She said it matter-of-factly, without drama, and then fell into comfortable silence beside me as we walked. I've thought about that sentence many times since. I should tell you now something about royal guards that I think most people don't understand, because I've spent years explaining them to tourists, and I still feel like the explanation never quite lands the way it should. The guards you see, the ones in the famous uniforms, the bearskin hats, the absolute stillness, they are members of the household division. Specifically, the foot guards. They belong to one of 5 regiments: the Grenadier Guards, the Coldstream Guards, the Scots Guards, the Irish Guards, or the Welsh Guards. Each regiment has its own insignia, its own history, its own particular traditions. What they all share is this: they are combat soldiers first. This is the thing people consistently misunderstand. Tourists see the ceremonial uniform and the stillness and the refusal to respond, and they process it as performance, as a show put on for visitors, as something theatrical and old-fashioned and essentially decorative. And it is theatrical, and it is old-fashioned, and it is done in significant part for the experience of the public. But these are not performers. These are soldiers who have, in most cases, served in active military roles in various parts of the world before being selected for ceremonial duties. The stillness is not the absence of capability. The stillness is what capability looks like when it has been refined to a particular point. I explain this to every group I take out. And yet, standing there on the mall that morning, having watched the guard do what he did, having watched him absorb Marcus's anger and the tourists' cameras, and the strangeness of his own position without breaking, without flinching, without giving away a single thing, I felt like I was understanding it differently than I had before. There's a difference between knowing something and knowing it. We completed the loop. We came back around toward the palace gates, where the tourists always want their photographs, where the guards at the actual formal posts stand in their actual formal positions, and the whole mechanism of it is exactly what everyone came to see. My group spread out along the railings. Phones emerged. The usual negotiations about angles and timing began. Gerald and Patricia stood side by side, and Patricia took out a small notebook and wrote something in it, which I found quietly moving in a way I couldn't entirely articulate. I stood back a little, the way I always do at this point. The tour isn't over, I still have closing remarks, the recommendation for where to go next, the answer to the inevitable final questions. But this is the moment where the group needs space to just be in the place, without commentary. Gion came and stood near me. She had her camera down again, which meant she was between photographs, which for her meant she was in thinking mode. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course." "The guard on the mall," she said. The tour guide was shouting at him. "Yes." And the guard just didn't respond. "No." She was quiet for a moment. Does that ever feel strange, to be someone who can't answer, who has to just stand there while someone shouts at you? I thought about that. I imagine it takes a certain kind of person, I said. Or a certain kind of training. Both, probably. She looked at the guards at the palace gate. "I've been photographing them since I arrived in London," she said. "I thought I was photographing the uniform, the stillness, the performance." She paused. "I think I was photographing something different without knowing it." "What do you think you were photographing?" I asked. She thought about it for a moment. "Something that has decided what it is," she said. "Something that doesn't have to explain itself." I didn't say anything to that. I just nodded, and we stood there for a moment in the specific, comfortable silence of two people who have arrived at the same thought from different directions. The tour ended 40 minutes later at the designated meeting point near St. James's Park. I gave my closing remarks, shorter than usual, I'll admit. The group dispersed. Gerald shook my hand and said it had been a memorable morning, which was, on reflection, a fairly precise description. Patricia said she hoped I stayed safe, and something about the way she said it, with emphasis, with genuine warmth, made me think she understood more about what had happened than she had let on. Kavitha was the last to go. She moved slowly, as she always did, but with that quality of absolute attentiveness that I had noticed all morning. When she reached me, she pressed something into my hand, a small note, written on a page torn from a pocket notebook. I looked at it. It said, "The quiet ones carry the most, Kavitha." I folded it carefully and put it in my jacket pocket, in the pocket with my phone, and I walked back toward the mall alone. The afternoon shift was a different group, a different route, a different set of strangers with different questions. This is the nature of the work. You hold things for your own private time. But I walked back past the mall on the way, because it was on my route. The guard was gone. Of course he was. His unusual posting there had been temporary, specific, and it had ended when its purpose ended. Whatever official machinery had placed him there had now moved him elsewhere. The mall was just the mall again. Wide, beautiful, the trees a little more golden than they had been that morning, tourists walking, a family with a pushchair, two cyclists, a runner. I stopped for a moment at the spot where he had stood. There was nothing there to mark it, no difference between that piece of path and any other piece of path. The city doesn't leave visible markers for the things that almost happen on it. It just continues. I stood there for a moment, then I walked on. 2 weeks later, I ran into Marcus. It was a rainy Tuesday, London rain, not dramatic, just persistent, and we were both at the same entry point near Horse Guards Parade, waiting for our respective groups. He was drinking coffee from a takeaway cup, and he had his green jacket on, as always. He saw me. I saw him. We both knew we were thinking about the same morning. He didn't apologize to me. There was no reason for him to. I wasn't the one he'd shouted at. And I didn't bring it up directly. That's not how this industry works. You don't debrief each other. You don't share notes, generally. But Marcus looked at me over his coffee cup and said, in the quiet way that people say things they've been sitting with for a while, "I've been doing this job for 9 years. I've seen a lot of strange things." "Same," I said. I shouted at a royal guard. "You did." He was quiet for a moment, rain tapping on both of us, steady and indifferent. "I thought he was just being difficult," he said. "I know. I didn't see it. Neither did I at first." He looked down at his coffee cup. Something moved across his face, not quite guilt, because there was no wrongdoing, and not quite embarrassment, because the circumstances had been genuinely confusing. It was more like the feeling you get when you realize you almost stepped on something that mattered, and you're only understanding now, 2 weeks later, how close the step was. "What made you stop?" he asked. "What made you not follow my group?" I thought about how to answer that. "His glove," I said, "and the way he moved his eyes." Marcus looked at me. Rain. Somewhere behind us a bus moved past, slow and careful on wet road. "Tiny things," he said. "Tiny things," I agreed. His group arrived then, the usual scatter of coats and umbrellas and excited faces. He straightened up, set his shoulders, raised his flag. The professional composure snapping into place with the ease of 9 years of practice. Before he turned toward his group, he said to me quietly, "I'm going to feel differently about those guards from now on." "Yeah," I said, "me too." I've told this story several times since that September morning. Not publicly, not until now. Just in the ordinary way that people share things that happened to them. Over dinner, to a friend who asked about the strangest thing I'd ever seen on the job. Once very late at night to my sister on the phone when we were both tired and talking about work and life, and the things that change how you see without you realizing they're doing it. Every time I tell it, someone asks the same question. What happened to the man near the trees? And the honest answer is, I don't know the full details. What I know is what I was told in a brief follow-up call from a police liaison officer about a week after the event. I'm not going to give details I'm not certain of. What I was told is that the situation was described as a security matter that was appropriately handled, and that no one had been harmed. Beyond that, the conversation ended with thanks and a very clear sense that further questions would not be productive. I asked one question before the call ended. I asked about the guard. The liaison officer was quiet for a moment and then said, "He did his job." That was all. He did his job. I want to spend some time, here in the last part of this account, talking about something that I've been circling around since the beginning. Something that the events of that morning made me think about, in a way I hadn't thought about it before. There is a version of that story in which the guard is the villain. It's the version you'd get if you only saw the first 15 minutes. A person in a position of perceived authority, refusing to communicate, refusing to explain, using the power of institutional silence to frustrate and humiliate someone who had a legitimate complaint. A tour guide losing his temper because the system refused to make space for ordinary people trying to do their ordinary work. It's a very easy story. It maps onto a dozen familiar narratives about bureaucracy and power, and the absurdity of ceremony divorced from function. And it's completely wrong. Not wrong because Marcus wasn't frustrated. He was, legitimately, and his frustration made sense given what he could see. Wrong because the visible surface of the situation was not the actual situation. This is the thing that has stayed with me most. We make judgments about what's happening based on what we can see. We have no choice. That's the only information available to us. And when a person's visible behavior seems obstructive, we assume obstruction. When someone won't answer us, we assume they have nothing worth saying. When the stillness looks like a refusal, we assume that's what it is. But the guard's stillness that morning was not a refusal. It was a decision made in a context that Marcus and I and every tourist on that path could not access. He knew something we didn't. He was operating on information that was invisible to us. His inability to communicate, his training not to communicate, was not a flaw in the system. It was a feature of it. You cannot tip off a person who is being watched. You cannot act differently around them without alerting them. You cannot gather your group, look at the man near the trees, and quietly herd people away without the man near the trees noticing. The only way to buy the time that needed to be bought to keep people back without causing a scene, to hold the line without breaking it, was exactly what the guard did. Stand. Be still. Absorb what came at him. Say nothing. It worked. I've thought about the specific nature of what it takes to do that. To stand and take it. To have someone shout at you in public in front of others and not answer. Not because you can't think of an answer. Not because you're indifferent to being shouted at, but because the answer would cost something you cannot spend. There is a kind of strength that is not visible as strength. It doesn't look like muscles or speed or the impressive actions that we recognize and applaud. It looks like nothing. It looks like a person standing still. It looks, to the untrained eye, like someone doing less than nothing. I think about that kind of strength differently now. Here's something I've changed about my tour since September. When we get to the part about the guards, which is usually near the palace gate, the place where people cluster and photograph, I have added something to my standard commentary. Not much. Not a long addition, just a few minutes that I didn't include before. I tell people what I told you earlier in this account, that these are combat soldiers, that the stillness is not performance, that they have histories in many cases that include service in active military contexts, before the bearskin hat, before the ceremony, in places where the stakes were entirely different. And then I tell them something else. I tell them that what looks like doing nothing is sometimes the most active thing a person can be doing. I don't tell them the specific story of September. That's mine and Marcus's and the guards, and in some small way Kavitha's and Gerald's and Gion's. It doesn't need to become a tourist anecdote. But I tell people to look differently. I tell them that stillness is not absence. The German trio, the three friends who had visited London before and considered themselves experts, sent me an email 3 weeks after the tour. I should explain that at the end of every tour, I give out a card with contact information in case anyone has follow-up questions or wants to book again. I get occasional emails, usually reviews, booking inquiries, things like that. This was different. It was from one of the three, a man named Dieter, which he introduced himself as in the email, explaining that he'd been on my September tour. He said he'd been reading about Royal Guards since the tour, not because of anything specific I'd said, but because, in his words, something about that morning made me want to understand them better. He'd read about the history, the regiments, the selection process, the training. He'd found accounts of former foot guards talking about what the ceremonial role actually means, what it feels like to stand at post, what the mental discipline involved actually requires. His email ended with a single paragraph that I've kept. He wrote, "I spent most of that morning thinking the guard was being stubborn and arrogant. I understand now that I was wrong. I think this kind of mistake, assuming the worst about someone who cannot defend themselves in the moment, is something I should try to make less often in the rest of my life. Thank you for a tour that accidentally taught me something I didn't expect." I read that email twice, and then saved it in a folder where I keep things I want to remember. There is one more moment from that day that I haven't told you about. I've been holding it for here because it belongs at the end. It was the moment right before I made that phone call, right before Gerald asked if something was wrong and I asked him to hold the group. I was standing there, looking at the guard, and looking at the man near the trees, and the two thoughts that should have been separate were connecting in my mind. And for one moment, just one, I doubted myself. I thought, you're reading into this. You're a tour guide who reads too much. The man near the trees is on his phone. People stand still all the time. You're about to call the emergency line and look like an idiot. That moment of doubt lasted maybe 5 seconds. And then I looked at the guard again. The guard who was standing in a position no guard is supposed to stand. The guard whose right glove was different from his left. The guard who had moved his eyes in one specific direction at one specific moment and then become completely still again. And I thought, he's doing something. Even if I'm wrong about what it is, he's doing something. That thought was enough. I made the call. I tell you about that moment of doubt because I want to be honest about the full picture. I was not brave. I did not have perfect clarity. I was not the hero of this story in any meaningful sense. I was a person who noticed something small and acted on it imperfectly, and it turned out to matter. The guard was the steady thing. The guard was the thing that held while everything else was uncertain. I keep coming back to that image, the one I've been carrying since September. A man in a red tunic and a bearskin hat, standing absolutely still on the mall in the early autumn light, absorbing a tour guide's anger and 20 tourists' cameras, and the full invisible weight of a situation that no one around him understood, and holding it all without moving, without speaking, without any visible acknowledgement that any of it was happening. Not performing, not decorating, not standing in for some old tradition that no longer connects to anything real. Doing his job, in the most precise and complete sense of that phrase. There are places in this city that feel, if you pay attention to them long enough, like they are doing more than they appear to be doing. The mall is one of them. On a clear morning, when the light comes through the trees in that particular early autumn way, and the palace is at the end of it like a point toward which everything gently organizes itself. There's something in that street that is older and quieter and more serious than the photographs suggest. I've walked it hundreds of times. I know every stone. But I walk it differently now. I look at the guards differently. I look at the spaces between things differently. I look at stillness differently. A few months after September, Jiyeon sent me a message through the tour company's contact form. She had gone back to South Korea by then, but she'd been thinking about the photographs she'd taken that morning. She said she'd gone through them when she got home and found one she hadn't remembered taking. A photograph of the guard on the mall. Not close, she'd been at some distance, so it was a longer shot. The guard in his position, the trees behind him, the mall stretching out. She said she'd had it printed, that it was hanging on her wall. She described it to me, a figure in red, completely still in the center of a wide path. Everything around him moving, blurred pedestrians in the background, leaves caught in motion, a bus visible at the edge of the frame. Just him in perfect focus still. She called it the photograph I didn't know I was taking. And then she said, I thought I was taking pictures of London. I think I was taking pictures of something that doesn't have a word for it in any language I know. Something about choosing to be exactly what you are, no matter what's happening around you. I read that message in a cafe near St. James's Park, on a gray November morning, with a cup of coffee going cold beside me. Outside the window, the city was doing what it always does. Moving. Noise. The ordinary, unstoppable machinery of millions of people going about their millions of lives. And I thought about a man standing still at the center of it, choosing to be exactly what he was, no matter what was happening around him. I don't know the guard's name. I don't know his regiment, his rank, his history, where he served before the mall, what he did when his shift ended that September morning. I don't know if he was told later what had happened, how the situation resolved, whether anyone said thank you. I hope someone said thank you, but I suspect it doesn't matter to him the way it might matter to the rest of us. I suspect that the job and the doing of it properly is its own kind of answer to everything else. I suspect that he went back to his post, or his regiment, or wherever he went, and he was exactly who he had been before. That's the last thing I want to say about him. Not that he was a hero, though maybe he was. Not that he saved lives, though maybe he did. Not any of the dramatic framings that we use when we want to make something feel big. Just this. He stood there when it mattered in complete silence and held the line. And the line held.